My name is Agatha Whitmore. I'm 78 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that love could conquer anything. I was raised in Millbrook, a small American town nestled between rolling hills and wheat fields, where neighbors knew not just each other's names but their histories, their struggles, and their dreams. This was a place where children still said, "Yes, ma'am," and "No, sir," where Sunday church services brought the whole community together, and where a handshake was worth more than any contract. I spent 43 years of my life as a schoolteacher at Millbrook Elementary, watching generations of children grow up, get married, and bring their own little ones to my classroom. I taught reading to mayors and mechanics alike, arithmetic to future doctors and farmers. My classroom walls were covered with thank you letters from students who had gone on to build beautiful lives, and I treasured every single one. After my dear husband Henry passed 15 years ago, taken too soon by a heart attack while he was fixing our old tractor, I thought my only son Milton would be my comfort in my golden years. I had visions of quiet evenings together, of him bringing grandchildren to visit, of growing old gracefully with his strong arm to lean on when my steps became unsteady. Lord, how wrong I was about so many things. But I was never more wrong about anything in my entire life than I was about my son. It was a Tuesday morning in March, one of those deceptive spring days when the sun shines bright, but the air still carries winter's bite. I remember every detail of that morning with the clarity that trauma burns into memory. I had made Milton's favorite breakfast, buttermilk pancakes with real maple syrup, the expensive kind from Vermont that I saved for special occasions. I had been so happy to see him visiting more frequently those past few months, foolishly interpreting his increased attention as filial devotion rather than the predatory circling it actually was. Milton had arrived the night before, claiming he wanted to spend more time with his dear old mom. He had always been charming, my boy, with his father's dark eyes and that smile that could melt butter on a cold day. Even at 43 years old, he retained that boyish quality that had gotten him out of trouble his entire life. But that morning, there was something different in his demeanor, a restless energy, a constant checking of his phone, eyes that wouldn't quite meet mine when we spoke. "Mom," he said over breakfast, cutting his pancakes with precise, almost mechanical movements, "didn't you say you had some of Dad's old tools down in the basement? I've been thinking about taking up woodworking, as a hobby. Dad always said I had good hands for it." My heart swelled with what I thought was a beautiful moment. Henry had indeed been a master craftsman, able to fashion anything from a simple birdhouse to the elegant rocking chair I still sat in every evening. The idea that Milton wanted to connect with his father's memory through woodworking seemed like the answer to years of prayers. "Oh, Milton, that would be wonderful," I exclaimed, probably too eagerly. "Your father would be so proud." "Yes, all his tools are down in the basement, in the storage room next to the big freezer. I've kept them exactly as he left them." It's funny how the mind works when you're remembering something terrible. I can still hear the scrape of his chair against the kitchen linoleum as he stood up, still see the way the morning light caught the gold in his teeth, a crown he'd gotten after a bar fight in his 20s that I'd paid for, naturally. I can remember thinking how handsome he still was, how much he looked like Henry at that age. "Let's go look at them now," he said, and there was something in his voice, an urgency that should have warned me, but I was too caught up in the moment to notice. We walked down the basement stairs together, past the water heater that hummed its familiar tune, past the shelves lined with my canning jars filled with peaches and green beans from last summer's garden. The basement had always been Henry's domain, organized with the precision of a man who believed there was a place for everything, and everything should be in its place. The walk-in freezer sat in the corner, like a white monument to my years of careful meal planning and bulk buying. Henry had installed it in 1987, back when we thought we might need to feed a house full of grandchildren someday. It was large enough to hold a whole side of beef, with thick walls and a heavy door that sealed tight enough to keep meat fresh for months. "The tools are in the storage room right next to it," I said, pointing to the adjacent door. "But maybe we should look in the freezer too. I think I might have some of your father's hunting supplies in there." That's when Milton stepped behind me. The shove came without warning, his hands flat against my back, sending me stumbling into the freezer, so hard I crashed against the back wall. Before I could even turn around, before I could process what was happening, I heard the heavy door slam shut with the finality of a coffin lid. The sound of the lock engaging was the most terrifying noise I had ever heard. "Milton!" I screamed, my voice immediately muffled by the thick walls. I scrambled to my feet and threw myself against the door, pounding with both fists. "Milton, this isn't funny. Let me out right now." But there was no response. Nothing but the terrible, mechanical hum of the freezer and the sound of my own breathing, already visible in white puffs in the suddenly frigid air. The cold hit me like a physical blow. At 78 years old, my circulation wasn't what it used to be, and I could feel the freezing air burning my lungs with every breath. My arthritis, usually just a dull ache in my joints, immediately flared into sharp, stabbing pain as the cold settled into my bones. I kept pounding on the door, screaming until my voice was hoarse. "Please, Milton. Please. I don't understand what's happening. Let me out." Through the thick walls, I could hear his footsteps moving away from the freezer, climbing the basement stairs. Then, faintly, I heard the sound of cabinet doors opening and closing, drawers being pulled out, papers rustling. The horrible reality began to settle over me like the cold itself, seeping into my understanding degree by degree. My son, the boy I had carried in my womb for 9 months, the child I had nursed through fevers and scraped knees, the man I had sacrificed everything for, wasn't coming back to let me out. He wanted me to die in here. I sank to the frozen floor, my legs unable to support me as the full weight of the betrayal crashed over me. This wasn't a prank gone wrong. This wasn't an accident. This was murder, planned and deliberate, carried out by my own flesh and blood. The freezer was kept at 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and I knew from my years of managing household emergencies that a person my age wouldn't last long in these conditions. Hypothermia would set in quickly, my body temperature dropping until my heart simply stopped beating. It would look like an accident. Poor old Mrs. Whitmore, confused and disoriented, accidentally locking herself in her own freezer. As the cold continued to seep through my cotton house dress and into my skin, I found myself thinking about all the times I had defended Milton to neighbors and friends. All the excuses I had made for his behavior over the years. All the warning signs I had chosen to ignore because I wanted so desperately to believe that my love could change him. Mrs. Henderson from church had tried to warn me just last month after Milton had borrowed money from several parishioners and never paid it back. "Agatha, honey," she had said with gentle concern, "that boy of yours has got a darkness in him. You need to protect yourself." But I had bristled at the suggestion. "Milton's just going through a rough patch," I had replied. "He's trying to start his own business. Sometimes that requires taking risks." Even Henry, God rest his precious soul, had tried to warn me before he died. During one of our last conversations, when he was too weak to get out of bed but still worried about our future, he had gripped my hand with what little strength he had left. "Agatha," he had whispered, his voice barely audible over the oxygen machine, "Milton's got a hunger in him that's not natural. When I'm gone, you watch him closely. Don't trust him with everything we've worked for." I had attributed his words to the pain medication, to the delirium that sometimes comes at the end. I thought he was just being an overprotective father, worried about leaving his family behind. Now, sitting on that frozen floor with my body temperature dropping and my breath coming in shorter gasps, I realized that Henry had seen something in our son that I had been too blind to recognize. Above me, I could hear Milton moving through the house with increasing boldness. The sound of my desk drawers being opened and rifled through. The distinct beep of my electronic safe being unlocked, the safe I had foolishly given him the combination to just 3 weeks earlier when he had convinced me he needed to help manage my affairs as I got older. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze even colder than the air around me. Laughter. Rich, genuine laughter, as if he had just heard the funniest joke in the world. My son was laughing while his mother was dying. I closed my eyes and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. How do you pray when your faith in everything good and decent has just been shattered? How do you ask God for help when the person trying to kill you is the child you brought into this world? Instead of prayers, memories began flooding my mind. moments from Milton's childhood that suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. The time when he was 8 and I caught him going through my purse, taking quarters from my change. When I had confronted him, he had looked me straight in the eye with no shame whatsoever. "But Mom, what's yours is mine, right? We're family." I had thought it was innocent childhood logic. Now I understood it was the first glimpse of the monster he would become. Or the incident when he was 15 and got caught stealing from the church collection plate during Sunday service. Pastor Williams had called me at home, his voice heavy with disappointment and concern. "Mrs. Whitmore, I hate to have to tell you this, but we have a problem with Milton." I had been mortified, but I had also been defensive. "There must be some mistake, Pastor. Milton would never." "I saw him myself, Agatha. And this isn't the first time. Mrs. Patterson says money has been going missing from the choir fund, and we've had reports of cash disappearing from purses left in the fellowship hall." Even then I had made excuses. Milton was acting out because he missed his father. He was just confused about boundaries. He would grow out of it. The cold was making me drowsy now, which I knew was a dangerous sign. My body was beginning to shut down, conserving energy for vital organs. My fingers and toes had gone completely numb, and I could no longer feel my face. Through the haze of approaching unconsciousness, I heard the phone ring upstairs, followed by Milton's cheerful voice answering. "Hello? Oh, hi there. Yeah, listen, I've got some bad news. My mom, she's had an accident. Real tragic situation. But hey, since you're in real estate, I'm going to need to sell this property pretty fast. Can you get me a quote by tomorrow morning?" Even through the thick floors and walls, I could hear the tone in his voice, excited, almost giddy. He wasn't even waiting for my body to get cold before he started selling off everything Henry and I had worked for. As my consciousness began to slip away, my last coherent thought was of the hidden document in James Morrison's office, my lawyer, Henry's old friend, who had helped me prepare for exactly this kind of betrayal 3 months ago. Milton thought he was so clever, but he had no idea what was waiting for him. I closed my eyes and felt myself drifting away, thinking, "Lord, if this is really the end, please let Henry be waiting for me. But if you have other plans, give me the strength to see justice done." The last thing I remembered before losing consciousness was the sound of Milton's voice, still on the phone, saying, No, she won't be needing the house anymore. Trust me on that one. If you think this is the worst thing a son could do to his mother, stay with me. The truth that came after will leave you speechless. Understand how my sweet baby boy became a man capable of attempted murder. I need to take you back to the beginning, back to when Milton was just a dream in my heart, and Henry and I were young newlyweds full of hope for the future. I was 23 when I married Henry Whitmore in the spring of 1967, in a simple ceremony at the First Baptist Church of Millbrook. I wore my mother's wedding dress, altered to fit my smaller frame, and carried wildflowers that Henry had picked from the meadow behind his family's farm. We didn't have much money for a fancy wedding, but we were rich in love and dreams. Henry was 25 then, strong and steady like the oak trees that dotted his family's property. He had calloused hands from working the land and kind brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He was the type of man who kept his word, who would drive 50 miles in a snowstorm to help a neighbor, who never met a stray dog or a lost child he wouldn't take in and care for. We spent our first 2 years as newlyweds learning each other's rhythms, building our little nest in the farmhouse that Henry's grandfather had built in 1923. Those were precious days. We would work side by side in the vegetable garden, dance to the radio in our tiny living room, and plan our future family while sitting on the porch swing Henry had made with his own hands. When I found out I was pregnant in the fall of 1969, we were over the moon with joy. Henry immediately started building a nursery, spending every evening after farm work crafting a crib, a changing table, and a toy box that he painted with cheerful yellow ducks. We spent hours choosing names, reading parenting books, and dreaming about the child we would raise together. Milton Henry Whitmore came into the world on March 15, 1970, after 18 hours of labor that had Henry pacing the hospital waiting room so frantically that the nurses kept bringing him coffee and telling him to sit down. When they finally let him in to meet his son, I'll never forget the look on his face. Pure, overwhelming love mixed with a kind of reverent terror at the responsibility we now carried. Milton was a beautiful baby, with dark hair like his father's and blue eyes that would eventually turn brown. He was also what the older ladies at church diplomatically called spirited. He cried more than most babies, demanded constant attention, and seemed to have an internal clock that was permanently set to middle of the night. But I didn't mind. I had waited so long to be a mother, and every sleepless night, every feeding, every diaper change felt like a privilege. I would rock him for hours in the chair Henry had made, singing lullabies and telling him stories about all the adventures we would have together. The first sign that something might be different about Milton came when he was about 2 years old. Most children that age are naturally selfish. It's normal development. But Milton's selfishness had a calculating quality that seemed unusual for such a young child. I remember the incident with Mrs. Patterson's cookies. She was our neighbor, an elderly widow who doted on Milton and always had homemade treats ready when we visited. One day, she set out a plate of chocolate chip cookies and told Milton he could have one. Instead of taking a cookie, he swept the entire plate into his arms and ran outside with them. When I found him behind the house, he had eaten 2 cookies and buried the rest in the dirt. "Milton, why didn't you share with the other children?" I asked, referring to Mrs. Patterson's grandchildren who were visiting. His answer chilled me, even though I didn't understand why at the time. "Because then there wouldn't be enough for me." "But honey, Mrs. Patterson would have made more cookies if you had shared these." He looked at me with those big brown eyes and said matter-of-factly, "But what if she didn't?" There was a logic to his thinking that seemed too adult, too coldly rational for a toddler. When Milton was 12 years old, tragedy struck our little family like a lightning bolt from a clear sky. Henry was out in the south field, working on our old tractor that had been giving him trouble all week. The machine was ancient even then, held together with prayers and spare parts, but Henry was determined to fix it rather than spend money we didn't have on a new one. I was in the kitchen preparing lunch when I heard the awful sound, a grinding crash followed by silence that seemed to stretch on forever. I ran outside calling Henry's name, my heart already knowing what my mind didn't want to accept. I found him pinned under the tractor, unconscious, but still breathing. The machine had rolled when the jack slipped, crushing his chest and internal organs. By the time the paramedics arrived, Henry was barely clinging to life. He lived for 3 days in the hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness, while Milton and I took turns holding his hand and praying for a miracle that never came. In his few lucid moments, Henry worried more about us than himself. "Take care of our boy, Agatha," he whispered during what would be our last real conversation. "But don't let him take advantage of your good heart. He's got a hunger in him that scares me." At the time, I thought Henry was just worried about leaving us alone. I promised him I would always love and protect Milton, no matter what. Henry died on a rainy Thursday morning in October 1982, leaving me a widow at 38 with a 12-year-old son and a mountain of debt I hadn't even known existed. The farm was mortgaged to the hilt, the medical bills were staggering, and I had no idea how I was going to survive, let alone provide for Milton's future. That's when I discovered what real sacrifice looks like. I sold the farm to pay off Henry's debts, keeping only the farmhouse and an acre of land. I took a job teaching 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary for $12,000 a year, and I cleaned offices at night for an additional $200 a month. I worked 7 days a week, often coming home so exhausted I could barely keep my eyes open long enough to help Milton with his homework. But I wanted him to have everything I'd never had. I wanted him to go to college, to have opportunities, to never know the grinding worry of wondering if you could pay the electric bill. So I wore the same 3 dresses in rotation for 2 years so Milton could have new school clothes every fall. I ate crackers and soup for lunch, so he could have a hot meal with meat every evening. When other kids got bicycles for Christmas, I worked extra shifts cleaning offices so Milton could have the best bike in town. When Milton wanted to play Little League, I couldn't afford the equipment fee, so I sold my mother's pearl earrings, the only valuable thing I had left from my family. When he wanted to take piano lessons, I took a 3rd job babysitting on weekends. Every sacrifice felt worthwhile when I saw his face light up. Every extra hour of work was justified by his success in school, his popularity with other children, his apparent happiness. But looking back now, I realized that my sacrifices were teaching Milton the wrong lesson entirely. Instead of learning gratitude and empathy, he was learning that he was entitled to have his desires fulfilled regardless of the cost to others. Instead of understanding the value of hard work, he was learning that things should simply appear when he wanted them. The warning signs were there, but I was too tired, too stressed, and too desperate to believe in his goodness to see them clearly. When Milton was 14, I started noticing that money would disappear from my purse. Just small amounts at first, a few dollars here and there. When I asked him about it, he would look genuinely confused. Maybe you miscounted, Mom. You've been working so hard lately. Maybe you just forgot what you spent. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. When he was 16, the incidents became more serious. The choir director at church called to tell me that $20 had gone missing from the fund they were raising for new robes. Milton had been helping count the money after Sunday service. I'm not accusing him directly, Mrs. Williams said carefully, but Milton was the only young person who had access to the money, and several people saw him handling the collection envelopes. I was mortified, but I was also defensive. There must be some explanation. Milton would never steal from the church. Mrs. Whitmore, I hope you're right. But money has been disappearing from various church activities for months now, and Milton is always involved somehow. I confronted Milton that evening, and his response was perfect, just the right mixture of hurt and indignation. Mom, I can't believe you would even ask me something like that. Haven't I been helping at church because you taught me it was the right thing to do? And now people are trying to blame me for their own carelessness. He even managed to produce tears. It hurts that you don't trust me. After everything I've been through, losing Dad and watching you work yourself to death, now I have to worry about people thinking I'm a thief. I ended up comforting him, apologizing for even bringing up the accusations. I even considered changing churches to protect him from what I convinced myself was unfair suspicion. The worst incident came during Milton's senior year of high school. I had been saving money for months, working double shifts and skipping meals, to buy him a car for graduation. It wasn't much, a used Honda with high mileage, but it was reliable transportation that would get him to his part-time job and eventually to college. I presented him with the keys on graduation morning, so proud and excited to give him this symbol of independence and my faith in his future. Milton's reaction was everything I had hoped for: genuine surprise, joy, gratitude. He hugged me tight and told me I was the best mother in the world. The next morning, I found him in the kitchen counting a stack of $20 bills. Milton, where did you get that money? He looked up with that charming smile that had gotten him out of trouble his whole life. I sold the car, Mom. Got $800 for it. For a moment, I couldn't process what he was saying. You sold the car? The car I just gave you yesterday. Mom, think about it logically. I don't really need a car right now, and $800 is a lot of money. We can use this for more important things. But Milton, that car was for your future, for getting to work, for college. He interrupted me with a patient tone, as if he were explaining something to a child. Mom, I'm your future. Everything you have is going to be mine someday anyway, right? I'm just collecting a little early to help us both out. There was something in his eyes as he said it, a coldness, a calculation that I had never seen before. For just a moment, I caught a glimpse of the man he would become, and it terrified me. But then he softened his expression and reached over to pat my hand. Besides, I can always get another car later. But right now, this money will help you pay some bills and take some pressure off. I'm trying to take care of you, Mom. And like a fool, I let him convince me that selling the car had been an act of selfless consideration. The money disappeared within a week, spent on what Milton vaguely described as investments in my future. When I asked for details, he became irritated. Mom, you have to trust me. I'm not a kid anymore. I know what I'm doing. But he wasn't investing in anything legitimate. I later learned from other parents that Milton had been buying expensive clothes, taking girls out to fancy restaurants, and generally living like someone with far more money than a teenager from a working-class family should have. When Milton left for college, on scholarships I had helped him apply for and with money I had scraped together for his expenses, I thought a new environment might help him mature. I thought being away from home, having to manage his own responsibilities, would teach him the values I had failed to instill. Instead, college seemed to make everything worse. Milton lasted exactly one semester before getting kicked out for academic dishonesty. But he didn't tell me that right away. For months, he continued to call and ask for money for books and lab fees and dormitory expenses, while he was actually living in an apartment off campus, not attending classes at all. When the truth finally came out, I was devastated. Not just because of the lies, but because of the money I had sent. Money earned by working 16-hour days. Money I had needed for my own expenses. Why, Milton? I asked during one of our tearful phone conversations. Why would you lie to me about something so important? His answer was casual, almost bored. Because I knew you'd freak out and make it into a big deal. This way, nobody got hurt. Nobody got hurt? Milton, I've been eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner, so I could send you money for school. Well, that was your choice, Mom. I never asked you to do that. That was the moment I should have realized that my son was fundamentally broken, that something essential was missing from his moral makeup. But instead, I convinced myself that he was just immature, that he would grow out of this selfish phase. Over the next 25 years, Milton drifted from job to job, relationship to relationship, scheme to scheme. He would disappear for months at a time, then show up at my door with stories of bad luck and unfair treatment. And every time, I would take him in, feed him, give him money, and send him back into the world with my blessing and my hope that this time would be different. He got married twice, both times to women with money who quickly figured out what he was and divorced him. He started several businesses that failed, leaving behind angry investors and unpaid debts. He was arrested twice for petty theft, once for fraud, and once for assault after a bar fight over gambling debts. And through it all, I made excuses. I blamed his behavior on losing his father so young, on the pressure of growing up poor, on bad influences and rotten luck. The truth was simpler and more terrible. I had raised a predator. Every act of love I had shown him, every sacrifice I had made, every time I had chosen his needs over my own, it had all fed the monster inside him, teaching him that other people existed solely to serve his desires. By the time Milton reached his 40s, he had learned to weaponize my love against me. He knew exactly what to say to make me feel guilty, exactly how to present his failures as temporary setbacks that just needed a little more support from dear old Mom. And I fell for it every single time because the alternative, accepting that my only child was beyond redemption, was too painful to bear. The visits became more frequent after Henry's death, but now I understand they weren't visits at all. They were reconnaissance missions. Milton was studying my routines, learning about my finances, figuring out exactly what I was worth and how he could get his hands on it. I should have seen the signs. But I thought a mother's love could change a son's heart. I was wrong about many things in my life, but I was never more wrong about anything than that. The darkness in that freezer was absolute, not just the absence of light, but the presence of something deeper and more terrifying. It was the darkness of understanding that the person you love most in the world sees you only as an obstacle to be removed. As I sat on that frozen floor, my body temperature dropping degree by degree, I forced myself to stay conscious by focusing on the sounds coming from upstairs. Each noise told a story of Milton's betrayal, and I needed to hear every chapter if I was going to survive long enough to write the ending. The first sound that reached me through the thick walls and floors was the opening and closing of my desk drawers in rapid succession. The desk where I kept all my important papers, birth certificates, insurance policies, the deed to the house, bank statements. I could picture Milton rifling through 40 years of carefully organized documents, looking for anything that would give him immediate access to my assets. Then came the distinctive electronic beeping of my safe opening. The sound made my heart sink even deeper than the cold had already dragged it. 3 weeks earlier, in a moment of what I now recognized as carefully orchestrated manipulation, Milton had convinced me to give him the combination. Mom, he had said with that concerned expression that I now understood was completely fabricated. What if something happens to you and I can't access important documents? What if there's an emergency and I need to get to your insurance information or medical records? He had been so persuasive, so seemingly thoughtful about my welfare. And I, trusting fool that I was, had not only given him the combination but had also shown him exactly where I kept cash for emergencies, about $3,000 that represented months of careful saving from my Social Security checks. Now, as I listened to him opening and closing the safe repeatedly, I knew that money was gone. But more than that, he was looking for the big score, information about my retirement accounts, my life insurance policy, any assets he could liquidate quickly once I was dead. What Milton didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that 3 months earlier I had made some changes to my financial arrangements. Changes inspired by his increasingly aggressive questions about my estate planning and his sudden interest in becoming more involved in managing my affairs. The cold was becoming more than just uncomfortable now, it was dangerous. I could feel my fingers and toes going numb, and my thinking was becoming sluggish in that way that hypothermia affects the brain. But I forced myself to stay alert, to listen, to remember every detail of what was happening above me. Through the mechanical hum of the freezer, I heard Milton's voice, loud and cheerful as he made phone calls. The first call was to a real estate agent. I recognized the name from signs around town. "Hi there, this is Milton Whitmore. Listen, I've got a property. I need to move fast. My mother just had a tragic accident, and I'm going to be inheriting her place. It's about 4 acres with a beautiful 1920s farmhouse, fully updated. Can you get me an appraisal by tomorrow?" The casual way he discussed my tragic accident, while I was still alive, still fighting for every breath in the frozen prison he had created, revealed the true depth of his monstrosity. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was calculated, premeditated murder with a business plan attached. The second call was to an antique dealer. "Yeah, I've got some really nice pieces. Depression-era furniture, handmade quilts, probably some collectible kitchenware. My mother was one of those people who never threw anything away, you know? When can you come by to look at everything?" My grandmother's rocking chair. The quilt my mother had made for my hope chest. The china set Henry and I had received as a wedding gift and used only on special occasions. Milton was already cataloging and pricing the artifacts of my life like I was nothing more than an estate sale. But it was the third call that broke my heart completely. "Pastor Williams? This is Milton Whitmore, Agatha's son. I have some terrible news. Mom had an accident this morning. No, she didn't make it. I found her in the basement freezer. It looks like she got confused and locked herself in somehow. Yes, it's just tragic. She was such a good woman. Thank you, Pastor. I know she would appreciate your prayers." The performance was Oscar-worthy. Milton's voice cracked with just the right amount of grief. He paused at all the appropriate moments, allowing the pastor to offer condolences. He even managed to produce what sounded like genuine tears. The funeral? Well, I think Mom would have wanted something simple. She always said not to make a fuss over her. "Yes, I'll call the funeral home this afternoon. Thank you so much for your support during this difficult time." He hung up and immediately burst into laughter. Not the broken laughter of grief or shock, but genuine amusement. He was actually enjoying this. As I listened to him make call after call, to insurance companies, to lawyers, to anyone who might help him cash in on my death, I realized that Milton had been planning this for much longer than I had suspected. This wasn't an impulsive act born of sudden desperation. This was the culmination of months, maybe years, of careful preparation. The cold was making me drowsy now, which I knew was the beginning of the end. Hypothermia kills in stages. First the shivering as your body tries to generate heat, then the confusion as your brain function becomes impaired, then the deadly drowsiness that leads to unconsciousness and death. But I couldn't let myself slip away. Not yet. There were things Milton didn't know, preparations I had made that would ensure his greed would be his downfall. 3 months ago, after noticing Milton's increasingly frequent visits and his pointed questions about my finances, I had made an appointment with James Morrison, Henry's old friend who had been handling our legal affairs for decades. "James," I had said during that appointment, "I need to tell you something, and I need your advice." I had explained my growing concerns about Milton's behavior, the way he had been pressuring me about my will, his suggestions that I was becoming forgetful and might need help managing my money, his casual comments about how much the house might be worth. James had listened with the gravity the situation deserved. He had seen this type of thing before, adult children who became impatient waiting for their inheritance, who began to see their aging parents as obstacles rather than people deserving of love and care. "Agatha," he had said, "I think we need to make some changes to your estate planning. Changes that will protect you and ensure that your wishes are respected, regardless of what anyone else might want." What James had created was brilliant, a trust structure with very specific conditions tied to the circumstances of my death. If I died peacefully of natural causes, Milton would inherit everything as originally planned. But if there were any suspicious circumstances, any signs of foul play or elder abuse, everything would go to charity instead. More importantly, James had insisted on installing a security system in my house, cameras that Milton didn't know about, recording devices that would capture any threats or suspicious behavior. "I hope we never need any of this," James had said as the technicians finished installing the hidden surveillance equipment. "But if Milton is becoming the kind of man I'm afraid he might be, this will protect you and ensure justice is done." The cameras were tiny, practically invisible, placed in strategic locations throughout the house. One in the kitchen, one in the living room, and most importantly, one in the basement that had a clear view of the freezer area. Everything was being recorded to a cloud storage system that only James had access to. Now, as I sat dying in that frozen tomb, I took comfort in knowing that every moment of Milton's betrayal was being documented. His casual phone calls about selling my property, his laughter after pretending to grieve to Pastor Williams, his complete lack of concern for my suffering, it was all being recorded. But I still had to survive long enough for that evidence to matter. The numbness was spreading from my extremities toward my core now. My thoughts were becoming increasingly disjointed, and I had to fight the overwhelming urge to simply close my eyes and let the cold take me. It would be so easy to just drift away, to escape the pain of knowing that my own son was capable of this level of cruelty. Instead, I forced myself to think about Henry. In my mind, I could hear his voice as clearly as if he were sitting beside me in that freezer. "Agatha, you're the strongest woman I ever met. You raised that boy through grief and hardship. You worked 3 jobs to give him opportunities. You never gave up on anything that mattered to you. Don't you dare give up now." I thought about all the students I had taught over the years, all the children who had looked up to me for guidance and strength. What would I tell them if they were facing an impossible situation? I would tell them to fight. I would tell them that giving up was never the answer, that there was always hope as long as you kept breathing. So I kept breathing, even though each breath burned my lungs and sent sharp pains through my chest. I thought about Mrs. Patterson, my elderly neighbor who had been like a mother to me after Henry died. She was 93 years old and still lived independently, still drove to church every Sunday, still baked cookies for the neighborhood children. If she could face each day with courage and dignity at 93, surely I could find the strength to survive this. I thought about all the women throughout history who had faced impossible odds and somehow found a way to persevere. My own grandmother had survived the Great Depression, raising 6 children on a farm while her husband looked for work in distant cities. My mother had worked in a munitions factory during World War II, contributing to the war effort while worrying every day about my father, who was fighting in the Pacific. I came from a long line of strong women who had faced hardship and emerged victorious. I would not be the first to surrender. Above me, Milton's voice continued its cheerful business calls. He had moved on from real estate and antiques to insurance companies, clearly trying to find out how quickly he could collect on my life insurance policy. "Yes, this is Milton Whitmore calling about my mother's policy. Agatha Whitmore. Yes, she passed away this morning. Tragic accident. How long does the claims process usually take?" Each word was like a knife in my heart, but it also fed my determination to survive. Milton thought he was so clever, but he had no idea what was waiting for him. The harder he worked to profit from my death, the more evidence he was creating against himself. The cold was making my arthritis flare up with excruciating intensity. Every joint in my body felt like it was being stabbed with ice picks. But I used that pain to stay conscious, to keep fighting against the hypothermia that was trying to claim me. I began to recite poetry in my mind, poems I had taught to thousands of students over the years. Maya Angelou's Still I Rise seemed particularly appropriate. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. Milton thought he was writing my history, but he had no idea of the strength that still lived within me. Hours passed. I couldn't tell how many, because time seemed distorted in that frozen darkness. Milton's phone calls became less frequent, replaced by the sounds of him moving through the house, opening closets, going through personal belongings. At one point, I heard him in my bedroom, rummaging through my jewelry box. The jewelry box that contained my wedding ring from Henry. I had stopped wearing it years ago because my arthritic fingers had swollen too much for it to fit properly, but I treasured it as a symbol of the love we had shared. I heard the distinctive sound of glass breaking, probably the music box that played The Way You Look Tonight, the song Henry and I had danced to at our wedding. Milton was probably looking for anything valuable, discarding sentimental items that meant nothing to him, but everything to me. The violation of my most personal spaces, my most treasured possessions, was almost worse than the physical danger I was facing. This was more than attempted murder. It was the complete destruction of my life, my memories, my identity. But then I heard something that gave me hope, the sound of a car door slamming in my driveway. Through the walls, I heard Milton's voice change from casual to concerned. "Hold on, someone's here," he said to whoever he was talking to on the phone. "Let me call you back." Then I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, young Tommy Peterson's voice calling my name. "Mrs. Whitmore? Mrs. Whitmore, your groceries are here." Tommy was the delivery boy from Patterson's Grocery, a sweet 19-year-old who brought my weekly shopping order every Tuesday. I had completely forgotten that this was Tuesday, that Tommy would be coming by with my usual order of milk, bread, and essentials. I tried to scream, but my voice was barely a whisper by now. The cold had damaged my vocal cords, and I could hardly make any sound at all. I heard Milton upstairs, probably trying to get rid of Tommy quickly. But Tommy was a persistent boy. If he had made the trip out to my house, he would make sure I received my groceries safely. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Tommy's voice was getting closer. He must have come into the house when no one answered the door. "Your door was unlocked, so I brought the groceries inside. Are you okay?" I summoned every ounce of strength I had left and began pounding on the freezer door with my numb fists. The sound was weak, but in the relative quiet of the basement, it might be audible. "Mrs. Whitmore, was that you?" Tommy's voice was definitely in the house now, and getting closer. I kept pounding, using my feet as well as my hands, making as much noise as my failing body could manage. Then I heard the most wonderful sound imaginable, Tommy's footsteps on the basement stairs. "Mrs. Whitmore, are you down here?" I pounded harder, putting everything I had into making noise. "Oh my God. Mrs. Whitmore, are you in the freezer?" The sound of a lock being turned was like the gates of heaven opening. Light flooded into my frozen prison, and I saw Tommy's shocked face, looking down at me. "Don't try to move," he said, pulling out his cell phone. "I'm calling 911 right now." As Tommy made the emergency call, I saw Milton appear at the top of the basement stairs, his face a mask of fake concern and barely concealed rage. "Oh no!" Milton exclaimed, rushing down the stairs.
"Mom."
"How did this happen?" "Tommy, thank God you found her." But I was looking into Milton's eyes, and I saw the truth there. Fury that his plan had been ruined, calculation as he tried to figure out how to salvage the situation. Tommy was young, but he wasn't stupid. As he helped wrap me in blankets while we waited for the paramedics, I saw him watching Milton carefully, noting the discrepancy between Milton's words and his demeanor. "How long has she been in there?" Tommy asked. "I don't know," Milton replied. "I was upstairs on business calls. I had no idea anything was wrong." But Tommy had sharp eyes, and I saw him looking around the basement, taking in the scene. The tools that Milton had claimed he wanted to see were still in their storage room, untouched. If we had come down here together to look at Henry's tools, why were they still exactly where they had always been? As the paramedics arrived and began working on me, checking my vital signs and preparing to transport me to the hospital, I caught Tommy's eye. Despite my weakness, I managed to mouth the words, "Help me." Tommy nodded almost imperceptibly. He understood that something wasn't right about this situation. The ride to the hospital was a blur of medical equipment and concerned voices. The paramedics were worried about hypothermia, about possible brain damage from the cold, about my heart which had been under tremendous stress. But I was focused on survival. I had made it through the worst part. Now I needed to recover, to get strong, and to make sure that Milton paid for what he had tried to do. As they wheeled me into the emergency room, I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Thank you, Lord. Thank you for Tommy Peterson. Thank you for giving me another chance. But even as I gave thanks for my survival, I was already planning what came next. Milton thought his plan had just hit a minor snag, but he had no idea what was coming. I thought it was my last breath. But destiny wasn't done with me, or with him. The hospital room was a symphony of beeping machines and hushed voices, but to me it sounded like the music of resurrection. After spending what felt like eternity in that frozen tomb, the warmth of heated blankets and the gentle hum of medical equipment felt like luxury beyond description. Dr. Sarah Chen, a slight woman with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, had been monitoring my condition since the ambulance brought me in. She explained that I had suffered moderate hypothermia and frostbite on my fingers and toes, but that I had been incredibly fortunate. Another 30 minutes in that freezer, she said, and my story would have had a very different ending. Mrs. Whitmore, she said gently as she checked my vital signs on the second day, you're recovering remarkably well for someone who went through such an ordeal. Your body temperature is back to normal, and while you'll need to be careful with those frostbitten areas for a while, I don't expect any permanent damage. I nodded gratefully, but my mind was focused on more than just my physical recovery. Every hour I spent in that hospital bed, I was planning. I was remembering every detail of Milton's phone calls, every moment of his performance, every piece of evidence that would prove what he had tried to do to me. Milton, of course, played his role perfectly during those 3 days in the hospital. He arrived within an hour of my admission, his face a mask of concern and devastation that would have fooled anyone who didn't know the truth.
Mom.
Oh, Mom. Thank God you're alive. He rushed to my bedside, tears streaming down his face in what appeared to be genuine relief. The doctors said it was touch and go for a while. I was so scared I was going to lose you. To the nurses, to Dr. Chun, to Pastor Williams who came to visit, Milton looked like the perfect devoted son. He brought flowers, roses from the expensive florist in town. He held my hand and spoke in soft, loving tones. He asked detailed questions about my treatment and prognosis, seeming to hang on every word the medical staff said. But I was watching his eyes, and in those brief moments when he thought no one was looking, I saw something very different. I saw calculation. I saw frustration. I saw a predator whose prey had escaped and was now figuring out the next move. On the second evening, when Milton thought I was asleep, he stepped into the hallway to make phone calls. The hospital walls were thin, and my hearing had always been sharp. What I heard confirmed my worst fears about what he had planned next. No, she's going to be fine. Tough old bird survived somehow, he said to someone, his voice lacking any of the warmth he displayed for the medical staff. But honestly, this whole incident just proves what I've been saying about her mental state. There was a pause while the other person responded. Exactly. I mean, who locks themselves in a freezer? She's clearly not competent to be living alone anymore. This is just going to make the power of attorney process much easier. My blood, which had just returned to normal temperature, ran cold again. Milton wasn't giving up, he was adapting. If he couldn't kill me for my money, he would have me declared incompetent and take control of my finances that way. I'm thinking I'll need to move in with her, at least temporarily, to make sure she's safe, he continued. And obviously, We'll need to get her affairs in order. She can't be trusted to make financial decisions anymore. I closed my eyes and controlled my breathing, maintaining the pretense of sleep while my mind raced. Milton was already spinning this incident into a narrative that would give him exactly what he wanted: complete control over my life and my assets. The next morning, when Dr. Chin came by for rounds, Milton was ready with his performance. "Doctor, I have to ask, is it normal for someone my mother's age to get confused and lock themselves in a freezer? I'm worried about her living alone if she's having these kinds of episodes." Dr. Chin looked at him thoughtfully. "Well, the circumstances were certainly unusual. But your mother seems mentally sharp to me. Her responses to questions have been appropriate, her memory seems intact, and she doesn't show signs of dementia or serious cognitive decline. But surely this incident suggests some level of confusion or disorientation." Milton pressed. "I mean, she doesn't even remember how she ended up in the freezer." That was a lie, of course. I remembered every detail of how I ended up in that freezer. But I had been careful not to contradict Milton's version of events while we were around hospital staff. I needed time to plan, time to gather strength, time to figure out the best way to expose the truth. Dr. Chin was clearly uncomfortable with Milton's line of questioning. "Mr. Whitmore, traumatic experiences can sometimes cause temporary memory gaps. That doesn't necessarily indicate broader cognitive problems. I'd recommend a thorough evaluation with a neurologist if you have concerns, but based on my observations, your mother seems to be mentally competent." I could see the frustration flicker across Milton's face before he controlled his expression and resumed his concerned son act. That afternoon, Tommy Peterson came to visit me. Sweet boy that he was. He had been worried about me ever since finding me in the freezer. He brought flowers, not expensive roses like Milton's, but a cheerful bouquet of wildflowers he had probably picked himself. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm so glad you're okay," he said, settling into the chair beside my bed. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't come by with your groceries." "Tommy," I said softly, reaching out to squeeze his hand, "you saved my life. I will never forget that." Milton was in the room during this visit, watching our interaction carefully. But Tommy was a smart young man, and I could see him putting pieces together. "Mrs. Whitmore, can I ask you something? When I found you, you seemed like you were trying to tell me something. Is everything okay?" It was a carefully worded question, but I understood what he was really asking. Had this really been an accident, or was there something more sinister going on? I glanced at Milton, who was watching us intently, then back at Tommy. "I'm just grateful you found me when you did, honey. Sometimes God sends angels when we need them most." Tommy nodded, but I could see in his eyes that he understood there was more to the story than he was hearing. After Tommy left, Milton's demeanor changed noticeably. The mask of concern slipped slightly, revealing irritation underneath. "Mom, you need to be careful about what you say to people. If you start telling stories about how you ended up in that freezer, people might think you're having hallucinations or memory problems." The threat was subtle but clear. If I told the truth about what happened, Milton would use it as evidence that I was mentally incompetent. "I don't remember much about how I got in there," I said carefully. "Everything is still very fuzzy." "That's probably for the best," Milton replied, and there was something cold in his tone that reminded me of the 12-year-old boy counting stolen quarters in my kitchen. On my third day in the hospital, as Dr. Chen was preparing my discharge papers, Milton made his move. "Doctor, I'm really concerned about my mother going home alone. This incident has me worried that she might not be safe living independently." "What are you suggesting?"
Dr. Chen asked.
"Well, I think I should move in with her, at least temporarily, to make sure she's eating properly, taking her medications, not having any more accidents." Dr. Chen looked at me. "Mrs. Whitmore, how do you feel about that arrangement?" Every instinct I had screamed against the idea of Milton living in my house, having access to my things, being in a position to control my daily life. But I also knew that refusing too adamantly would play into his narrative about my mental competence. "I suppose it might be good to have some help for a little while," I said reluctantly, "until I'm fully recovered." Milton's smile was triumphant, though he tried to disguise it as relief. "I just want to take care of you, Mom. After what happened, I couldn't live with myself if something else happened and I wasn't there to help." As they wheeled me out of the hospital, I caught sight of myself in a mirror and was shocked by what I saw. I looked fragile, elderly in a way I hadn't before the freezer incident. My hair, usually neat and styled, was thin and unkempt. My face was pale and drawn, with dark circles under my eyes that made me look every one of my 78 years. But appearances can be deceiving. Inside that frail-looking body, something fierce and determined was awakening, something that had been dormant for too long. Milton thought he had me right where he wanted me. He thought I was broken, defeated, ready to be molded into the helpless victim he needed me to be. He had no idea that surviving his attempt to kill me had ignited a fire in me that had been banked but never extinguished. As we drove home from the hospital, Milton chatted cheerfully about his plans for taking care of me. He would handle my banking, he said. He would manage my medications. He would take over the household maintenance and decision-making. "I know it's hard to give up your independence, Mom," he said with fake sympathy, "but this is really for the best. You'll be much safer with me looking after everything." I nodded and made appropriate sounds of agreement, but in my mind, I was already planning. I was remembering the hidden cameras James Morrison had installed, the trust documents Milton knew nothing about, the evidence that was even now being gathered against him. Milton had made one crucial mistake in his attempt to murder me. He had failed. And in failing, he had revealed his true nature not just to me, but to the hidden cameras that had recorded everything. He thought surviving the freezer was the end of my story. But it was actually just the beginning. As we pulled into my driveway and I saw my house, the house Henry and I had filled with love, the house where I had raised Milton and sacrificed everything for his future, I made a silent promise. Milton wanted a war. He was about to get one. But first, I needed to get stronger. I needed to be patient. I needed to let him think he was winning while I prepared for the battle that would determine not just my future, but whether justice would be served for what he had tried to do to me. That evening, as Milton settled into Henry's old study like he owned the place, I sat in my rocking chair and whispered to myself the words that would become my battle cry. He has no idea what's coming. If you've ever been betrayed by your own blood, you'll want to hear how I answered my son's cruelty. The beautiful thing about being underestimated is that it gives you power people don't see coming. For the next several weeks, as I recovered from my ordeal in the freezer, I played the part Milton needed me to play. The confused, grateful elderly mother who is lucky to have such a devoted son looking after her. But while Milton thought I was becoming more dependent on him, I was actually growing stronger every day. Not just physically, though Dr. Chun had been right about my resilience. The frostbite healed, my circulation improved, and my energy returned. More importantly, I was growing stronger mentally and emotionally, fueled by a righteous anger that had been building inside me for decades. Milton had moved into Henry's study with the casual entitlement of someone who believed the house already belonged to him. He rearranged the furniture to suit his preferences, hung his clothes in Henry's closet, and used Henry's desk as his personal office. Every change he made felt like a desecration of my husband's memory, but I bit my tongue and said nothing. "I hope you don't mind me making myself comfortable, Mom," he said one morning over breakfast, not really asking for permission. "I figure if I'm going to be here taking care of you, I might as well settle in properly." "Of course, dear," I replied, maintaining the sweet, submissive tone I had perfected. "I'm just so grateful to have you here." But I was watching everything, cataloging every invasion of privacy, every presumption of ownership, every moment when his mask slipped and revealed the greedy, calculating man underneath. Milton's first order of business was gaining control of my finances. He approached this goal with the patience of a spider spinning a web, starting with small, seemingly reasonable requests. "Mom, I've been looking at your bills, and I think there might be some mistakes. Your electric bill seems high for this time of year. Maybe I should call them and straighten things out." "That's very thoughtful of you, Milton. And this credit card statement. There are some charges here that don't look right. I should probably talk to the bank about it. But I'll need to be authorized on your account to handle these things for you." Step by step, day by day, he worked to insert himself into every aspect of my financial life. And I let him, because I needed him to reveal the full extent of his intentions before I struck back. What Milton didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that 3 months before his attempt to murder me, I had taken steps to protect myself that went far beyond anything he could imagine. It had started with a conversation I'd had with Mrs. Henderson after church one Sunday. She had pulled me aside with a concerned expression and said quietly, "Agatha, I hope you don't mind me asking, but is everything all right with Milton? Some of us have noticed he's been asking a lot of questions about your financial situation." I had been defensive at first, as I always was when anyone criticized Milton. "He's just trying to be helpful, Eleanor. He worries about me living alone." "Honey, I've seen this before with other families in the church. Adult children who start hovering around their elderly parents, asking about wills and insurance policies. It doesn't always end well." Mrs. Henderson's words had planted a seed of concern that grew over the following weeks. I began paying closer attention to Milton's visits, to his questions, to the way he looked at my house and possessions like he was taking inventory. That's when I decided to visit James Morrison. James had been Henry's best friend since childhood, the best man at our wedding, and the lawyer who had handled all our family's legal affairs for 40 years. He was 75 himself now, officially retired but still maintaining a small practice for long-time clients like me. When I told James about my concerns regarding Milton's behavior, his expression grew grave. "Agatha, I hate to say this, but what you're describing fits a pattern I've seen too many times. Elder financial abuse is more common than people realize, and it's often perpetrated by family members. But surely Milton wouldn't. I mean, he's my son." "That's exactly what makes it so effective," James said gently. "Nobody wants to believe that their own child would hurt them. But Agatha, you need to face the possibility that Milton might not have your best interests at heart." That conversation led to a complete restructuring of my estate plan, designed specifically to protect me from the kind of manipulation I was beginning to fear Milton might attempt. "The first thing we need to do," James explained, "is create what's called a revocable living trust. This will allow you to maintain control of your assets while you're alive and competent, but it will also include provisions that trigger if there's any evidence of coercion or abuse." The trust that James created was a masterpiece of legal protection. On the surface, it looked like a standard estate plan. If I died of natural causes, Milton would inherit everything as my only child. But buried in the legal language were clauses that would strip him of his inheritance if certain conditions were met. If I died under suspicious circumstances, everything would go to charity. If there was evidence that I had been threatened, coerced, or abused, everything would go to charity. If I was declared incompetent under circumstances that suggested manipulation or fraud, everything would go to charity. But the most beautiful part of the plan was that Milton would have no idea any of this existed until it was too late. "The key," James explained, "is that this trust is completely separate from your existing will. Milton knows about your will because you've discussed it with him. But this trust supersedes the will, and he has no knowledge of its existence." James had also insisted on something that made me uncomfortable at first, but that I now realized was essential: surveillance equipment. "Agatha, if Milton is planning to take advantage of you, he's probably not going to do it in front of witnesses. We need to document any threats, any coercion, any behavior that proves he's not acting in your best interests." The cameras were tiny, practically invisible, placed throughout the house by a security company that specialized in protecting elderly clients. Everything was recorded to cloud storage that only James could access, creating an unalterable record of everything that happened in my home. Now, as I sat in my kitchen watching Milton rifle through my personal papers with the casual entitlement of someone who believed he already owned everything, I took comfort in knowing that every moment of his behavior was being documented. "Mom, we need to talk about something important," Milton said one morning over coffee, spreading a stack of documents across the kitchen table. "I've been reviewing your financial situation, and I'm concerned about how you're managing your money." I looked at the papers he had laid out: bank statements, investment account summaries, insurance policies, all obtained without my explicit permission. "What do you mean, dear?" "Well, for example, you have money sitting in checking accounts that could be earning more in investments. And some of these insurance policies seem unnecessary at your age." I think I should take over managing these things for you. It was exactly the conversation James had predicted Milton would eventually have with me. The setup for taking control of my finances under the guise of helping me manage them more effectively. I don't know, Milton. Your father and I always handled our own finances. I'm not sure I'm ready to give up that responsibility. Milton's expression hardened slightly before he caught himself and resumed his patient, caring demeanor. Mom, I understand this is difficult. But you have to face facts. You're not getting any younger, and this incident with the freezer shows that you're not thinking as clearly as you used to. What if you make a mistake with your investments? What if someone takes advantage of you? The irony of Milton warning me about someone taking advantage of me would have been funny if it weren't so sinister. I suppose I could think about it, I said hesitantly. Actually, I've already prepared some paperwork that would make this transition easier. Milton pulled out another set of documents. This is a power of attorney form. It would give me the legal authority to handle your financial affairs while still allowing you to maintain control over day-to-day decisions. I looked at the papers, pretending to read them carefully while my heart raced. This was it, the moment James had prepared me for. Milton was making his move to gain complete control over my assets. I'm not sure I understand all this legal language, I said, playing the confused elderly woman perfectly. Don't worry about the details, Mom. The important thing is that it would allow me to protect your money and make sure all your bills are paid on time. You wouldn't have to worry about any of that stuff anymore. Milton's voice was patient and reassuring, but I could see the predatory gleam in his eyes. He thought he had me right where he wanted me, confused, grateful, dependent on his help. Could I have James Morrison look at these papers first? You know how your father always insisted on having our lawyer review anything important before we signed it. The flash of anger that crossed Milton's face was quickly suppressed, but I saw it clearly. Mom, James Morrison is practically senile. He's got to be pushing 80 by now. Besides, this is just standard paperwork. Nothing complicated about it. Still, I'd feel better having him take a look. It's what Henry would have wanted. Milton's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly.
Fine.
But don't take too long with this, okay? The longer we wait, the more vulnerable your assets are to market fluctuations and other risks. That evening, after Milton had gone out for what he claimed was dinner with old friends, I called James Morrison. He's making his move, I said simply. Are you safe, Agatha? Do you need me to come over there? I'm fine for now. But James, I want you to know, I'm ready to fight back. I'm tired of pretending to be weak and confused while he plots to steal everything Henry and I worked for. What do you need from me? I want to review all the surveillance footage from the day he locked me in the freezer. I want to see exactly what he said and did while he thought I was dying. And then I want to plan how we're going to destroy him. James was quiet for a moment. Agatha, are you sure about this? Once we start down this path, there's no going back. Milton is your son. No, I said firmly. A son doesn't try to murder his mother for money. Milton stopped being my son the moment he locked that freezer door. Now he's just a criminal who needs to be stopped. The next morning, Milton presented me with the power of attorney papers again, this time with more pressure. Mom, I really think we should get this signed today. I've been talking to some financial advisors, and they say the market is about to become very volatile. We need to move quickly to protect your assets. I pretended to waver, to be torn between caution and gratitude for his concern. I suppose if you really think it's necessary. I do, Mom. I really do. And remember, this doesn't mean you're giving up control. It just means I can help you when you need it. I picked up the pen, then paused. Milton, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you love me? He looked surprised by the question. What kind of question is that? Of course I love you, Mom. You're my mother. And you would never hurt me? Never take advantage of me? Mom, how can you even ask that? Everything I'm doing is to protect you and take care of you. Haven't I proven that by moving in here and dedicating my life to your welfare? I looked into his eyes as he said these words, searching for any hint of genuine emotion, any spark of the love he claimed to feel. But all I saw was calculation, the cold assessment of a predator measuring its prey. You're right, I said softly. I'm sorry for doubting you. But instead of signing the papers, I set the pen down and stood up from the table. I think I need to lie down for a while. All this talk about finances is making me feel overwhelmed. Milton's frustration was palpable, but he managed to keep his voice calm. Of course, Mom.
You rest.
We can finish this later. As I walked toward my bedroom, I heard him on the phone again, his voice low but not quite low enough. She's being difficult about the power of attorney. I know. But the old bat is more stubborn than I expected. No, I can't push too hard or she'll get suspicious. I need her to think this is all her idea. I closed my bedroom door and sat on the edge of my bed, my hands shaking with rage. Not fear, I was past fear now. Pure, righteous anger at the monster I had raised, at the years I had wasted trying to love someone who was incapable of loving anyone but himself. But I was also excited because I knew something Milton didn't know. Every word of that phone conversation, every moment of his manipulation, every second of his true nature being revealed, it was all being recorded. Milton thought he was hunting me, but the truth was exactly the opposite. He was walking into a trap that had been 3 months in the making, and he had no idea that the frail, confused old woman he was trying to manipulate had teeth sharper than his own. He thought I was broken. But a mother can rise from ashes when her child becomes the fire. The end came swifter than even I had anticipated, though not in the way I had originally planned. I had been prepared for a long, careful campaign to expose Milton's true nature, methodically gathering evidence, building a legal case, watching him hang himself with his own greed. But Milton's hunger for my assets was a beast that couldn't be satisfied with patience or subtlety. It started with the debts. In my naive understanding of my son's character, I had assumed his financial problems were relatively minor, the kind of temporary setbacks that many middle-aged men experience. I had no idea of the true scope of his desperation. The first sign came 3 weeks after he moved into my house. A man showed up at my front door, a big man with cold eyes and scars on his knuckles, asking for Milton. "Is Milton Whitmore here?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that makes smart people step aside. "He's not home right now," I replied, instinctively knowing that this man represented trouble. "Can I take a message? Tell him Danny Castellano came by. Tell him his payment is 3 weeks overdue, and Mr. Torino is getting impatient." The end came swifter than even I had anticipated, though not in the way I had originally planned. I had been prepared for a long, careful campaign to expose Milton's true nature, methodically gathering evidence, building a legal case, watching him hang himself with his own greed. But Milton's hunger for my assets was a beast that couldn't be satisfied with patience or subtlety. It started with the debts. In my naive understanding of my son's character, I had assumed his financial problems were relatively minor, the kind of temporary setbacks that many middle-aged men experience. I had no idea of the true scope of his desperation. The first sign came 3 weeks after he moved into my house. A man showed up at my front door, a big man with cold eyes and scars on his knuckles, asking for Milton. "Is Milton Whitmore here?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that makes smart people step aside. "He's not home right now," I replied, instinctively knowing that this man represented trouble. "Can I take a message? Tell him Danny Castellano came by. Tell him his payment is 3 weeks overdue, and Mr. Torino is getting impatient." The name sent a chill through me, though I pretended not to recognize it. I had heard whispers at church and the grocery store about Torino, a local loan shark who funded desperate men and collected his debts in ways that often left scars deeper than money could cover. When Milton returned that evening, flushed and jittery, I mentioned casually, "A man named Danny came by looking for you. He said something about Mr. Torino." Milton's face drained of color. For a moment, he looked like a boy again, caught, panicked, cornered. Then he forced a laugh. "Just some business associates, Mom. Nothing you need to worry about." But I did worry, because I knew that men like Torino didn't drop by unless they were already running out of patience. Over the next days, Milton grew more erratic. He spent long hours on the phone, pacing the study, his voice alternating between desperate pleading and venomous anger. He went out late at night, returning smelling of alcohol and sweat, his hands shaking. And then one evening it happened. I had just finished washing the dinner dishes when I heard a crash from the study. Hurrying in, I found Milton on the floor, his face pale, his breathing ragged. He clutched the power of attorney documents in one hand and a half-empty bottle of whiskey in the other. "They're going to kill me, Mom," he cried, his voice cracking. "If I don't get them the money, they'll kill me." His mask was gone now. The proud, scheming son who thought he was the master of the game had been replaced by a terrified little boy, begging his mother to save him. "Milton," I said softly, kneeling beside him. "What have you done?" He shook his head, tears spilling down his face. "I borrowed money, too much. I thought I could pay it back after I got control of your accounts.
But they want it now.
They don't care about excuses." I wanted to weep, not just for what he had become, but for the son I had lost long ago to greed and selfishness.
But I didn't cry.
I couldn't, because even in his desperation, his eyes darted toward my purse, toward the drawer where I kept my checkbook. He wasn't crying for forgiveness. He was crying for money. That night, while Milton drank himself into a stupor, I made my final decision. I called James Morrison and told him everything. The videos, the threats, the freezer, the debts. It was time to act. The next day, the sheriff arrived with a court order. Milton was arrested for attempted elder abuse, fraud, and multiple financial crimes uncovered during James's quiet investigation. The look on his face as they led him away was one I will never forget: rage, disbelief, and something that looked very much like hatred. But it didn't end there. 2 nights later, I received the news. Milton had been found dead in his jail cell. The sheriff said it was an incident with another inmate connected to Torino's organization. A disagreement that ended with my son on the cold concrete floor, his eyes staring at nothing. I sat in my rocking chair all night, staring at the moon through the window, my heart heavy but strangely calm. My son was gone. Not just the greedy man he became, but the little boy I once cradled, the teenager I once defended, the man I once hoped would carry Henry's legacy forward. Milton had destroyed himself, not because of me, but because of the monster inside him he never tried to tame. And me? I was alive. Bruised, frostbitten, and forever scarred, but alive. My house was quiet again. My husband's study remained untouched. My finances were safe in the trust James had built. I had faced the darkest betrayal a mother could endure, and I had survived. My name is Agatha Whitmore, and this has been my story. If you are listening to this, I want you to remember something. Blood does not excuse betrayal. No matter how much we love our children, we must never let their greed destroy us. If my story touched your heart, share it so others will know they are not alone. And please, subscribe and comment where you are watching from, because I have more truths to tell and you will want to hear them.